which determines the extracellular fluid volume. This is regulated in the kidneys, out of which 99% are reabsorbed. The 1% of the sodium, whether it is getting filtered or it is getting reabsorbed, depending upon that, the ECF volume is determined. In an ideal situation, 150 millimoles of input should lead to a 150 millimoles of output. Whenever there is an increase in the input or the ECF expands, ECF volume expands, this will lead to the stimulation of receptors in the arteries and veins. These receptors are both stretch as well as osmoreceptors. They are present both in the arteries and in the veins. Once these are stimulated, they will send signals. These signals act via the renal nerves, hormones, various hormones that are secreted, and the physical changes that happens in the kidneys. All of this will send signals to the kidneys, and it will lead to increase in the excretion of sodium. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So the opposite happens when the intake of sodium is less than the output, and that will lead to an increase in the reabsorption of sodium. So ideally, suppose this is our cell. There are two cells, and this is the blood vessel. So we have the ECF, which is the plasma. I'm talking about only the plasma here. And then this is a cell. Intracellularly, the concentration of sodium is less and potassium is more, as we all know. These are the cations. And as for the anions, we have the phosphates and the sulfates, which are in higher concentration, and bicarb is in the lower concentration. Inside the plasma, the sodium is in the higher concentration, potassium is low. And for the anions, bicarb and chloride are the major ones, out of which chloride is usually more. Now what happens is we have the sodium potassium ATPase pump, which plays a very major role in regulating the concentration of sodium inside the cell as well as in the plasma. It acts against a concentration gradient as it is energy dependent. So 3 sodium from inside the cell is always pushed into the plasma, and 2 potassium is pushed inside the cell. So whenever there is a change in the plasma concentration of sodium, or whenever there is a change in the osmolality in the plasma, this sodium potassium ATPase pump plays a major role, because whenever we talk about sodium moving from one compartment to the other compartment, it always accompanies with water. So there are some substances or some solutes which are present in our plasma that are ineffective osmoles, because they do not take part in any of the regulatory mechanism whenever there is a change in the osmolality. As I told earlier, whenever we talk about sodium balance, we cannot ignore water balance. They both go hand in hand. So I'm going to talk a few words about the water balance. Three major mechanisms play an important role in regulating the water balance. These are vasopressin secretion, the amount of water that is ingested, and the renal water transport. How the kidneys handle the water that we intake. So all of these three mechanisms, they maintain a serum osmolality of 280 to 295 milliosmoles per kg. And this is of very vital importance. And for all calculative purposes, we consider a plasma osmolality of 290. Now, how is this vasopressin secreted? Just a quick, I'll tell a quick method of how it comes. It's regulated from the hypothalamus. So this is the hypothalamus. We have the pituitary here, anterior and the posterior pituitary. There are certain magnocellular neurons which are present in the hypothalamus. So these neurons, the distal end of their axons, they end in the posterior pituitary, and they stimulate the secretion of arginine vasopressin, which induces thirst. Though the thirst is a very complicated mechanism, out of which arginine vasopressin is only one such important mechanism by which thirst is stimulated. Whenever in the blood, in the plasma, whenever there is an increase in osmolality or there is a decrease in osmolality, this acts via various non-selective stretch-activated cation channels. These are non-selective stretch-activated cation channels. These channels, what they do is, they stimulate the hypothalamus. So whenever the osmolality is more, ideally what should happen, because our blood is getting hyperosmolar, we need more amount of fluid in the blood inside the plasma, inside the intravascular compartment. So ideally we need more amount of arginine vasopressin, and that's what is going to happen. So it will stimulate the posterior pituitary, more of arginine vasopressin is secreted, and thirst response increases. Also water retention increases. And the opposite happens when the osmolality is reduced. So this can be depicted in a chart. So somewhere between 280 to 295 is the normal osmolality. So this will be our normal osmolality. And this graph here depicts the arginine vasopressin levels in picograms per mmol. So 2, 4, and 8 picograms. So whenever there is a the osmolality is normal, the plasma osmolality is normal, and we are in a euvolemic state, the secretion of arginine vasopressin is very steady, and it happens in a very slow raise manner. So this is when there is a euvolemia, or when the osmolality is normal. But when you have hypoosmolality, or when you are in a hypovolemic state, what happens is the osmolality threshold is reduced, and at even lower levels of osmolality, the arginine vasopressin tends to have a steep raise. This is what happens in a hypovolemic state or in a hypoosmolar state. But when coming to an hyperosmolar state, the arginine vasopressin secretion is reduced, and it also happens in a hypervolemic state. It's actually more of a plateau. A few words about arginine vasopressin. Its T-half is very small, short. It has a T-half of 10 to 20 minutes, especially when it's in the circulation. Its function is excretion or retention of solute-free water. Its action is via the V2 receptors, and they are presented in the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle, as well as P cells of, that is the principal cells of collecting duct. So what is the mechanism by which this arginine vasopressin acts? As we said earlier, arginine vasopressin binds with the V2 receptor. It causes an increase in intracellular cyclic AMP, which further leads to activation of protein kinase A. This is the most important step, because once this happens, this protein kinase A is responsible for proteins as well as AVP protein kinase A dependent sodium potassium chloride channel transport. So now we know that this channel is dependent on protein kinase A as well as on arginine vasopressin. So when this happens, this channel is very important, that is located in the thick ascending limb of loop of Henle, as we know. So this channel is very important in the counter current transport, and this counter current transport is in turn very important because this maintains the osmolality of inner medulla. To be more specific, the interstitium of the inner medulla, and hence it helps in the water absorption. So now we know that the sodium, whatever changes happens in the sodium, it's going to affect directly and indirectly, it's going to affect the water absorption also. So as we all know, okay, so this is the cortex. This is the outer part of the medulla, and this is the inner part of the medulla. Now, water absorption happens all throughout the nephrons. So whenever sodium chloride gets filtrated, water has to move out of every part of the nephron. So in all the cortex, outer medulla, as well as inner medulla, water gets reabsorbed. And for in the proximal convoluted tubule, aquaporin 1 is the major channel through which water gets reabsorbed, and in the cortex and outer medulla and in the inner medulla, we have the aquaporin 2 and 3. But in inner medulla, in addition to 2 and 3, we also have 4. Along with water, the main thing which regulates the absorption of water inside the renal medullary interstitium is the urea, transported into the medullary interstitium, and that happens via urea transporter A1 and A3 in the collecting duct, and via the urea transport A2 in the proximal convoluted tubule. So this is about water reabsorption. I'm not going in depth about water reabsorption as of now because our topic doesn't concern that, but since it was important here, I had to mention. Now we are going to discuss about the renal handling of sodium. So as we know, about 27,000 millimoles of sodium gets filtered every day, out of which 60% gets reabsorbed in the PCT and 30% gets reabsorbed in the thick ascending limb. About 7% gets absorbed in the DCT and 3% gets reabsorbed in the late part of DCT and collecting duct cumulatively. In the proximal convoluted tubule, this is because of sodium glucose, sodium amino acid, and sodium phosphate co-transport, and sodium H plus antiport. So these are the channels which are responsible for the 60% absorption of sodium. And as we know, in the TAL part of the nephron, it is because of sodium potassium chloride channel, and in the DCT, it is because of the sodium chloride channel. And all of this absorption of reabsorption of sodium, it is an ATP dependent process. Because for all of these channels to work, we need the sodium potassium ATPase pump. And this also plays a major role in the feedback mechanisms, which I'll talk about it later. In the late DCT and in the collecting duct, the reabsorption happens with the help of P cells and intercalated cells. And that is under the influence of aldosterone. So the two major mechanisms are RAS and direct activation of aldosterone that happens because of a raise in potassium. This is more important in regulating the aldosterone secretion rather than sodium or water per se. Because since we think that aldosterone is responsible for sodium water retention, those are the solutes which are going to affect aldosterone secretion. But apparently it is the potassium which plays a major role, because in the P cells, I mean, the function of the principal cells are sodium reabsorption, water reabsorption, and potassium secretion. And this is a very sensitive process. So even a slight raise in potassium values tends to activate the P cells, and this P cell activate the P cells via the aldosterone. The intercalated cells, we can remember it as acid. So they are responsible for H plus secretion. This is the major role of the I cells. Now, for the entire sodium regulation to happen in the nephron, two major feedback mechanisms act. So one is from the glomerulus to the tubules. The other one is from the tubules to the glomerulus. So from the glomerulus, it is the glomerular tubular feedback, and from the tubules, it is the tubuloglomerular feedback. The I'm going to talk about each, just a few words. The tubuloglomerular feedback, how it acts. So what happens is, whenever there is a raise in the GFR, what happens is we have a raise in sodium and chloride levels in the tubular fluid. And this in turn activates the macula densa cells, and these are the they act as the sensors for both sodium as well as chloride. So most of the time we think that only it is sensitive to sodium, but apparently it is also sensitive to chloride. And this will lead to an increase in sodium and chloride reabsorption, which in turn leads to increase in sodium potassium ATPase activity. Increased ATP hydrolysis happens for the ATP channel to function, and this will in turn lead to an increase in adenosine levels. And this is very important, because this entire tubuloglomerular feedback can be mediated by an increased level of adenosine in our blood. So this is a major mediator of tubuloglomerular feedback. So when this adenosine levels are increased, what they do is they're going to cause smooth muscle contraction of the afferent arterioles, and that will be mediated by the A1 receptor. A1 receptor in the afferent arteriole will constrict the smooth muscles, and this will in turn inhibit, it will decrease the GFR. So that is how the GFR is regulated. It's actually a regulation of the GFR, but here the sodium and chloride, they play a major role, and that is how it happens. The other one is the glomerular tubular feedback mechanism. This is actually considered as the third factor, because the primary factor was tubuloglomerular feedback. The secondary factor is something called as the myogenic mechanism of auto regulation. But this is a very controversial place, because many people in many studies, they have shown that this may not be this plays an important role in GFR regulation, but how much it is important in the regulation of sodium levels in the body, that is debatable. So the third factor would be the glomerular feedback mechanism. This works in a way that when the GFR is raised, our filtration fraction is also raised, and this in turn causes a raise in the oncotic pressure of peritubular capillaries. Because of which there is a reduction in the rate of sodium reabsorption. So this is what is happening in the glomerular feedback. Coming to the topic per se now. So, hyponatremia. Sodium levels of less than 135, it's considered as hyponatremia. What is considered as severe hyponatremia? In children and in adults. In children, any value less than 125 and in adults less than 120 is considered as severe hyponatremia. Now, when we talk about hyponatremia, there is something called as true and something called as pseudo. There are a lot of difficulty in understanding these terms. So I will talk about the classification first, and I'll incorporate those terms as we speak so that it will be easier to understand. So first of all, when we talk about a patient comes to us with symptoms of hyponatremia, we do an investigation, we see the sodium levels and it is low. So once we see a low sodium value, we have to think whether the patient is in a hyperosmolar state, normal, the osmolarity is normal, or is in a hypoosmolar state. So when the patient, I'm going to talk about each of this separately. So when we talk about hyperosmolar state, we need to understand a few basic things here. So we know what is osmosis, right? So when there is a closed compartment which is separated by a semi-permeable membrane, there is fluid on either side. So we have some solutes here. I have some solutes here. So just by looking at this, we know that this compartment B is contains more solute than the compartment A. So obviously the water content in A is more than B, and water is going to flow from a lower concentration area to a higher concentration area, which means that the flow of water would be in this direction. This is how it's going to flow. This is in order to maintain the osmotic equilibrium. But what happens is the presence of all the solutes do not cause a similar effect when it comes in vivo. In vitro, it's fine, but then in vivo, what happens is we have, as I told you earlier, we have certain mechanisms like the ATPase, sodium potassium ATPase pump that's functioning, other transport proteins which are present. All of this, they tend to prevent the movement of water. For each solutes, it is different. So most of the osmotically active agents that we know and we encounter in day-to-day life is glucose, mannitol, radioactive contrast. These are all highly osmotically active. Urea, these are osmotically active, sorbitol and all this stuff. So now what happens is when urea is present in the plasma in a higher concentration, urea has the property to move freely throughout all parts of the throughout all the compartment, whether be it intracellular space or it be the extracellular space, including the interstitium or the plasma. So what happens is it tends to move freely. So if there is increase in urea in the plasma, this will automatically tend to move into the ICF. If there is 20 rays in the plasma, 10 of it will move into the intracellular compartment and it will try to normalize the plasma osmolality. Because of which there is not much changes in the sodium concentration when urea is present in a higher quantity, in a higher amount in the plasma. But this is not the case with glucose. Glucose cannot permeate through all these membranes and it cannot equilibrate itself. So whenever there is a raise in glucose or some other osmotically active components like radioactive contrast and mannitol that we give, that is the entire purpose of effective. So since it stays within the intravascular compartment, we are able to use it for cerebral edema patients where we need to pull the water out of the cells and into the circulation. So in case of glucose, what happens is since it cannot move freely, it will stay inside the compartment and it will try to pull the water from the intracellular compartment into the extracellular space. So when I have more amount of glucose here, what happens is the water from the cells, it tends to get pulled into the plasma and it causes intracellular dehydration. Now, whenever a substance increases the osmolality of the plasma, it is called as an hyperosmolar substance. And if they are able to drag water along with them, it is called as hypertonic. Therefore, not all hyperosmolar substances are hypertonic because, as I said, urea does not pull water inside the plasma. Next, plasma osmolality. How do we calculate plasma osmolality? We know that it is glucose by 18 plus urea by 6 plus 2 into sodium. I know we are used to the formula of BUN by 2.8. This is because urea is nothing but 2.14 times of BUN. Now, what happens in case of increase in glucose in plasma? As we said earlier, it's going to pull water and this will lead to dilutional hyponatremia. And that is why whenever we have a patient with hyponatremia, we first look at the glucose levels. I'll discuss a case scenario here. Suppose the glucose level is 540, urea is 54, for example, the sodium levels are 132. So now we know that the patient is having increase in glucose and a very mild decrease in the sodium. But now we don't know if it is a dilutional hyponatremia or it is a actual hyponatremia that we are dealing with because of some other cause. So for that to know, first thing that we need to do is it true hypoosmolar hyponatremia? For that, hyperosmolar, sorry. So for that, we need to calculate the plasma osmolarity, as I said. So in this patient, if you calculate the plasma osmolarity, it comes somewhere around 3.7. So we know that the it is hyperosmolar plasma. As of now, we know that. But we still don't know if it is because of the glucose per se or if it is because of something else. So the next step would be, if hyponatremia is due to dilutional from the shift of ICF to ECF alone, that we need to know. And for this, we need to apply the correction factor. And what is the correction factor? For every, suppose my blood sugar level is 540 here, right? So for every 100 mg increase above 100 mg per dl, for every 100 mg increase in glucose above 100 mg per dl, my sodium should drop by 1.6 millimoles per liter. But this holds good only till 400 mg per dl. Beyond 400 mg, the sodium drops by 2.4 millimoles per liter. So in this case scenario, if we calculate, so ours was 450 mg per dl, right? So when you calculate, it is going to be 3 times of 1.6 plus 1.4 times of 2.6, which will give you about 8.2 drop from normal. So our expected sodium in this patient would be 140 is for all calculative purposes, we take the normal value as 140 sodium level minus 8.2, it's going to be 131.8. And here our sodium is 132. So very close by. This correct the sodium? No. So the entire purpose of going through all this mathematical strain is because we need to know if you want to give the patient sodium correction, whether it be oral or just a plain NS or whatever it is, whether you need to know whether to give the patient sodium correction or not. In this case, all you have to do is correct the patient's glucose and the patient is going to be fine, even if they are symptomatic. So we can correct the glucose alone. This is all we need to know about hyperosmolar conditions. The next I would like to talk about is isotonic hyponatremia. And this is the one which is termed as pseudohyponatremia. Why? I'll discuss. So first, how do we calculate sodium here? In most of the laboratories, the sodium levels are calculated by a method of flame photometry. It was invented in 1960s or somewhere around 1950s, but still this holds good because it's a very easy method and it is proven to be almost very accurate. But the best method is something different. I'll tell you what it is, but then this is what is being followed. In flame photometry, we have a very major drawback, and that drawback is the one which is leading to the diagnosis of pseudohyponatremia. So to understand this, consider there is a compartment, intravascular compartment. Suppose this is a 1 liter compartment. Out of this, we have in every plasma we have something called as the aqueous and a non-aqueous compartment. What are these non-aqueous osmolality of the fluid? Those are the substances which do not take part in the osmolality, and we do not use them in the calculation of plasma osmolality. So suppose out of this 1 liter, usually, for example, if I have 70 ml of non-aqueous compartment and 930 liters, sorry, 930 ml of aqueous compartment, my sodium constitutes here, because I'm going to, this is what is being calculated in our plasma osmolality, right? So sodium is going to be here. But what happens when there is an increase in the non-aqueous compartment? Still my sodium is going to be here. For example, this is 900 ml and this is somewhere around 100 ml. My sodium is going to be still counted as from the, I'm going to take a sample, and the sample withdrawn is going to be from the entire intravascular compartment. So there will be a, I cannot tell you this as a dilutional hyponatremia, because the water content is the same, the solute particles, we shouldn't say it as the solute particles because they are osmotically inactive. But there are certain substances which have increased inside the plasma compartment. So we cannot tell you, we cannot say this as a dilutional hyponatremia. But the sodium levels are going to be less when you measure them. And this will be a pseudo hyponatremia because the actual content of sodium for that column of blood is going to be the same. But since we are drawing the blood and other particles are also there, it's going to show you a lesser value of sodium. So what are these non-aqueous compartment, non-aqueous substances which can lead to a false value? Most of the time, these are lipids, more importantly, triglycerides, and globulins, hyperglobulinemia. So now what do we have to do? Once you know there is a hyponatremia and you know that you are calculating the plasma osmolality and the patient's plasma osmolality is normal. So now we have to correct for the lipid and the protein levels to make sure that we are not dealing with a disease per se rather than a actual hyponatremia. For correction, the factor is, in case of increased proteins, it is the decrease in serum sodium in millimoles per liter would be plasma protein levels in grams per deciliter minus 8 minus the normal plasma, permissible plasma protein level into 0.25. So what does this mean? This means that if my protein level, total body protein level increases by 4 grams per dl, my sodium would drop by only 1 millimole per liter. So it is that insignificant. So for every raise of 4, my sodium would drop only by 1 millimole, which is very, very, very less. So unless and until our protein levels are, especially in malignant conditions like MGUS or multiple myelomas or globulinias, only in those conditions where the plasma protein levels are going to be very high, this can be significant. Or else in normal patients, usually we don't encounter a very high protein level. And the correction factor for increase in lipids is even insignificant. So the decrease in serum sodium would be about, the formula would be triglycerides in mg per dl into 0.002. So only if your triglyceride levels are about 500 mg per dl, you will have a serum sodium drop by 1 millimole per liter. So this is even less. In case of hypertriglyceridemia patients, most of the time the serum sodium is normal. So this happens very rarely. But the most important thing that we encounter and the most common is hypoosmolar hyponatremia. And this is called as true hyponatremia. So whenever there is a sodium deficit in our body, sodium deficit is nothing but the normal sodium levels minus the the sodium levels that we have measured. So whenever this sodium deficit happens, it will lead, and along with hypotonicity, whenever it happens, it will lead to the activation of adaptive mechanisms. There are a lot of adaptive mechanisms. Most of the time, if this adaptive mechanism sets in, and by the time the patient's sodium levels are corrected, most of the damages that have happened because of hypotonicity and hyponatremia is reversed. But when it persists for more than 48 hours, that's when we encounter all the complications. And as I told you earlier, the sodium potassium ATPase system is very important in the regulation of sodium. So what it does is, there are 4 adaptive mechanisms. One is the sodium potassium ATPase. The other one is organic osmolytes, aquaporin channels. These 3 are the most important ones that help. There are only 3 adaptive mechanisms, I'm sorry, and these 3 are important in the regulation. Now, adaptive, as I told you earlier, sodium potassium ATPase helps in the sodium extrusion. But eventually, what happens is this sodium extrusion can also extend to potassium extrusion. But this is the one which happens in the initial phase. Aquaporin channels, they help in the water influx into the brain via the glial cells, and they lead to swelling of the neurons. But in order to protect the brain neurons, what happens is, as a compensatory mechanism, this water is shunted into the astrocytes. But when all of this is reversible until it reaches the astrocytes. Once the astrocytes starts to swell up, and this usually happens more than 48 hours, this is one of the reasons why it becomes irreversible. Coming to the organic osmolytes, there are a lot of substances like glycine, taurine, creatine, myoinositol, glutamate. All these organic osmolytes, basically they act as substances which drag water along with them. So they tend to maintain the, because whenever there is a sodium movement, there is going to be a water movement also along with it. So they tend to maintain the movement of water. But then all of this, if it sets in more than 48 hours, it's going to create permanent damage. Earlier okay, so this is the reason why there is also the development of complication of overcorrection of sodium, earlier known as central pontine melanosis, but nowadays it is not, that's not the term that we use. It is osmotic demyelination syndrome, because it's not just the pons which is affected. It can affect globally anywhere, and therefore it is termed as osmotic demyelination syndrome. The clinical features of hyponatremia, it's very varied. A spectrum of symptoms can happen, but the most common that part that is involved is the CNS. So sometimes it has been studied that environmental situations like humidity, temperature, and even rain, because in certain parts the monsoon in southwest region, the monsoon has shown to play a role in increase in the incidence of hyponatremia. So environmental factors do play a role, and the symptoms depend upon the age, the rate at which the sodium levels are decreasing, and whether it is an acute or chronic presentation. So acute is when it is less than 48 hours, and chronic is when you have no documented value of sodium within the last 48 hours. Patient can be asymptomatic, but even when they are asymptomatic, we have to look for subtle gait or cognitive changes, which is reversible. And most of the time we tend to neglect this in a busy OPD, or when the emergency ward is very busy. Cognitive changes are usually interpreted as psychiatric illnesses, and most of the time we just think that the patient is being functional, but it could be because of a low sodium value too. Early symptoms that can happen would be nausea, vomiting, and headache, which are like very non-specific. And when it goes to a point of being severe, the patient will develop the more pronounced neurological manifestations like altered sensorium, seizures, coma, brainstem herniation, and eventually demise. Now, the cranial vault can accommodate up to 10% increase in the volume of the brain. Because of cerebral edema, obviously there is going to be a swelling of the brain, and then up till 10%, the vault can handle it. But once it reaches more than 10%, then you're going to have brainstem herniation, and that's going to be fatal. We have a term called acute hyponatremic encephalopathy, which constitutes all of these symptoms that I mentioned in severe hyponatremia. And the chances of, once the patient goes in for acute hyponatremic encephalopathy, the chances that the patient will recover out of it is less than 30%. So there is a very good chance we might lose the patient. There can also be normocapnic or hypercapnic respiratory failure, something called as the neurogenic pulmonary edema, wherein the pressure, wedge pressure, would be normal. Now, acute raise in sodium, acute decrease in sodium levels, it is a medical emergency, because most of the times it is more than 10%, the brain gets swelled more than 10%, and most of the time they present with severe manifestations. These are the patients who do not come with asymptomatic presentations or early nausea and vomiting kind of complaints. These are the ones who present in the emergency ward. So what are the causes? It's mainly because of iatrogenic. This could be because of, so the underlying mechanism why you get acute hyponatremia is basically there is a raise in the circulating levels of arginine vasopressin, and there is an increase in the free water. So these are the two major mechanisms that are going to act. So whatever causes, or there is an increase in iatrogenic introduction of hypotonic solutions, we are providing the patient some hypotonic solutions for various therapeutic and diagnostic procedures. So any of this can lead to a acute hyponatremia. So post-op patients, post-menopausal women, in these patients, the risk of encephalopathy is very high, especially in post-op and post-menopausal patients. The risk of encephalopathy is very high. And the basic mechanism is, as I told you, the circulating AVP and the free water in the plasma is increased in these two conditions. And then, for example, glycine irrigation, which is given in cases of TURP procedures, resection of prostate. So TURP procedures, in uterine surgeries, ventriculotomy procedures, colonoscopy procedures. In these procedures, glycine is not used. Glycine is used only in TURP and uterine surgeries. But the mechanism is the same, because in all of these, we are introducing iatrogenic hypotonic solution inside the patient's body. So that is the reason why you get hyponatremia. Reset institution of thiazides. This is very, very important. So whenever we put the patient on thiazides, we have to monitor their serum sodium levels until they have attained a stable blood pressure along with the stable serum sodium levels. Polydipsia. Drugs like MDMA. This is ecstasy, which can act as a potent induction of thirst. So the patient is going to drink more water. Free water is going to increase, and exercise induced. This is because of increase in arginine vasopressin in the circulation. Now, how do you proceed? Now you know the patient is in hypotonic hyponatremia. How do you proceed? Harrison mentions that first we need to assess the ECF volume, and from there you take to the serum sodium levels. But I have found it is easier to do the other way around, because by that way you can actually rule out the other stuff, the pseudo hyponatremia and hyperosmolar hyponatremia can be ruled out. So when you know it is only hypotonic hyponatremia, we again go and recheck the ECF volume. So this is hypotonic hyponatremia, and I'm checking the ECF. There are three possibilities that can happen here. It could either be normal, it could be low, or it could be high. But how do we know? How do we assess the ECF volume? It is always clinical, because we don't have any proper parameter to measure the ECF volume which is available very easily. So we look into the clinical profile. If the patient is presenting with postural hypotension or postural tachycardia, or if the patient is having decreased skin turgor, signs of dehydration, and the most sensitive one is the urine output. If there is less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour, oliguria. If the patient is having oliguria, this is the most specific indicator of a hypotonic hyponatremia. And if the patient is having an increased ECF volume, we all know the patient will have raised JVP, ascites, fluid, all volume overload status features. So if neither of those persists, then it is mostly not isotonic. So the first step in assessment of hypotonic hyponatremia is we find out the plasma osmolality, we make sure it is hypotonic, and then we look at the ECF volume status, and then we look at the urine sodium. Now, if the urine sodium is more than 20 or less than 20, why do we need to know this? We need to know whether the cause is a renal cause or an extra-renal cause. More than 20, it is going to be a renal cause, and less than 20, it is going to be extra-renal. So once we have established this, we are going to see into the urine potassium levels, because This renal cause, what is the exact mechanism of the renal cause? That would be established by a urine potassium level. So again, if it is more than 20 or less than 20. In some books, they say that it is less than 10, both urine sodium as well as urine potassium. And the in between 10 to 20 is a gray zone. But Harrison has mentioned it as less than 20 and more than 20, so we can stick to that. So if it is more than 20, then the possible cause is tubulointerstitial disorders, vomiting, diuretic use. There are a lot of causes, but then I'm just giving you a gist of what it could be. So out of which diuretic use is very, very important. And if it is less than 20, it is mostly because of diminished adrenal response. This could be because of anything. So whenever there is a raise in urine sodium and a drop in urine potassium, we have to think about a diminished adrenal response. Just a second. Yeah, so here it is. So these are the causes that has been enlisted if the urine sodium is more. In this, when there is drop in urine sodium, most of the other causes they come under the increased urinary potassium excretion. So whenever the urine sodium is less, it's going to be extrarenal causes. Okay, and whenever there is a euvolemic state, we will talk about that later. I'll discuss about that later. But this is the part of the flowchart I wanted to explain. So, how do you manage true hyponatremia? Management. First is we need to withdraw all the offensive substances, whether it is the drugs or if there is a cause that could be corrected, we should see if we are able to correct it. Then you have to look at the status of hypovolemia. How much the hypovolemia is actually persisting, whether it is doubtful or it is actually present, if there are any features suggestive of hypovolemia. And the third one is, if there is an emergency situation, you know the patient is having very low sodium levels and you don't know exactly or we can see if the patient is stabilizing. This is especially when there is a hemodynamic instability. The hypovolemia status is doubtful, then we can always go with the fluid challenge. This fluid challenge would be 500 ml to 1 liter. We can give a fluid challenge and then we can see how the patient responds. What are the indications for sodium correction? In order to correct the sodium per se, you should have symptomatic hyponatremia, or the patient should present to you in an acute crisis with a serum sodium level of less than 110 millimoles per liter. And the most important is the rate at which the infusion can be given. The rate of infusion can be determined by 3 parameters. So first is, if it is a mild to moderate case, then you can give the infusion at 0.5 millimoles per liter per hour. And if the patient is presenting to you with seizures, then your correction would be 2 to 3 millimoles per liter per hour within the first 2 to 3 hours. If the patient is presenting with seizure, you can give up to 2 to 3 millimoles per liter per hour. And then the maximum dose, how much you can give. Maximum permissible dosage would be 8 millimoles per liter in 8 hours, and up to a maximum of 10 to 12 millimoles per liter can be given in 24 hours. So this is the rate at which the correction should be given. If you are correcting it anywhere more than 18 millimoles in 48 hours or more than 8 to 10 millimoles excuse me, in 24 hours, this can lead to ODS, osmotic demyelination syndrome. So we have to be very careful. Apparently, we have to check every once in every 2 hours or once in every hour, you have to check the serum sodium levels when you are correcting the patient. But yeah, it's difficult to do, but then that is how it has to be done. Calculation of sodium deficit. How do we calculate it? First, we need to know the total body water of the patient. What is the total body water? It is nothing but 50% of the body weight in case of female and 60% of the body weight in case of men. That is how we know the total body water. This total body water into the normal sodium levels, which we take it as 140 for practical purposes, minus the what is the patient's sodium value. This is how we calculate the sodium deficit. Once you have calculated the sodium deficit, we need to calculate the rate of raise of sodium. So grossly, we have we know this is like we follow it like as a universe. Then if you want to know the actual rate at which we use, the rate of raise of sodium has to be determined with the help of the formula sodium in infusate minus the patient's sodium, which is divided by the total body water plus 1. If at all the infusate that we use is ringer lactate, for example, which contains even potassium, right? So in those cases, even the potassium should be included here. But no, the patient's potassium value need not be included because it's the infusate that's going to matter. So if at all you are going to infuse the infusate containing potassium, please include the potassium values also in this. And the sodium is corrected based on the safe limits, not on the normal limits. We don't need to correct the values. This is the wrong thing that we do. We don't need to correct numbers. We need to correct it up to a safe limit. If the patient's sodium level is 110 or it is 109, you can maximum correct it up to plus 8, right? So it is somewhere around 117 in 24 hours. You don't need to get a value of 130 or 140 in case of these patients. So you have to be very careful. We need to maintain the safe limits rather than going in for the normal limits. So after correcting the plasma sodium, we need to treat the cause. So if there, as we discussed, there are n number of causes, and out of which you need to see which are the causes that are treatable. I would like to say a few words about the SIADH here because I've not discussed it in depth. It's a separate topic in itself. So in case of SIADH, once we have corrected the sodium, even in those patients, these are euvolemic patients. These are the patients who do not they have a euvolemic status. They do not have any signs of edema. Though there is a free water retention in the plasma, they do not have any edema. But sodium levels can be normal or it will be diminished. There will be hyponatremia. The urine sodium excretion is usually more than 20. This can also occur in other conditions like glucocorticoid deficiency, hypothyroid deficiency, or in stress, all these conditions. But if you have a euvolemic status and the urine sodium is less than 20, that could be because of the other non-specific hyponatremic causes that we discussed, the irrigation, TERP procedures, colonoscopy procedures, tap water enema, polydipsia, psychogenic polydipsia, or any iatrogenic hypotonic fluid that we give, all these conditions. If the patient is having a hypervolemia, like for example, if the ECF volume is small, as we discussed, volume overload status patient with hyponatremia, if the urine sodium is more than 20, it is mostly renal cause. So it can either be an AKI or a CKD. And if the urine sodium level is less than 20, it can be any of these three, either nephrotic, cirrhotic, or cardiac failure. In this condition, what happens is the effective arterial blood volume is diminished because all the fluid is going into the third space. We are going to have third space fluid accumulation. This will in turn, but the effective blood volume is reduced, right? So that is going to act via the glomerular feedback mechanism. It is going to, and it is also going to increase the ADH levels, which will lead to again sodium water retention. But in this case, because of ADH, the free water retention actually exceeds the solute retention. That is why we have a dilutional hyponatremia in this condition. Okay, so that is about this flow chart. Now I'm just going to discuss about some remaining of the management part. I think with that we can wind up. So now we have corrected the sodium. We have seen into the causes. We have whatever could be corrected, we have done that. What is the next step that we can do is we can try a trial of water deprivation. It has not been proven to be a good treatment method, but then in case of hyponatremia or with free water retention, but in certain cases of SIADH, they have said that even before going to pharmacological therapy, it's better to try a water deprivation therapy before going for pharmacotherapy. So for this, we need to know the urine to plasma electrolyte ratio, because based on this, we know how much of free water is being retained. So the urine to plasma electrolyte ratio can be determined by urine sodium plus urine potassium divided by plasma sodium. So once you determine this, the ratio can either be more than 1, less 1, or less than 1. If it is more than 1, then you don't have to be very strict on the fluid restriction. So you can give up to, the restriction could be about less than 1 liter per day. If it is less than 1, then you have to be very strict in the fluid restriction, and it is about less than 500 ml per day. And if it is somewhere in between, then it could be between 500 to 700 ml per day. This can be tried, but it has very poor outcomes. So like it's not that good. If the patient's potassium is low, we try to replace it with potassium replacements. But we have to be very careful while giving potassium replacement, because this itself can correct the sodium at times. So on top of your sodium correction, if you potassium correction, if you are going to correct the sodium hydrogenically, then there is a very good chance we are going to land up with hypernatremia rather than correcting the cause. We are going to overcorrect it. So when you have a concomitant potassium loss, also low serum potassium levels, first correct the potassium and then go for the sodium. Always potassium, because this itself will tend to bring it to normal. So once the potassium has been corrected, whatever deficit is remaining, you can correct it. Can be later on corrected. It has been proven that oral preparations of salt or even of palatable urea, nowadays even palatable urea tablets are available. These have been proven to be superior than IV from fluids that we give. They have better reabsorption and they have a better chance of retaining the free fluid. So better chance of excreting the free fluid. So it is better to use oral formulations. If all of this fails, then we can go for pharmacotherapy. In pharmacotherapy, I'm going to talk more in all the other causes of hypotonic hyponatremia. We don't go in for the pharmacological treatment. It pertains mainly to the SIADH. So in SIADH, we can give tablet Lasix 20 mg BD plus oral salt tablets. So how does this act? This will inhibit the countercurrent transport and it will reduce the urine's concentrating ability. So more of water will be washed out. Oral salt tablet, they act as a diuretic accessory, diuretic associated natriuresis. If this fails, then we can go with tablet demiclocycline. This acts by inhibiting the principal cells. But the problem with demiclocycline is it is nephrotoxic. The last is Vaptans. We can try Vaptans. A few words about Vaptans. These are nothing but AVP antagonists. They are used in SIADH, wherein they cause, and also they have been tried in hypervolemic hyponatremia, especially in cases with congestive cardiac failure and cirrhosis. This is new. The mechanism of action of Vaptans is it causes an augmentation of free water clearance. That is, it increases the free water clearance. That's a free water excretion. That is why it is also called as the aquaretic effect. And this action is made by inhibiting the V2 receptor. We have the most commonly used, the most commonly available. There is only one oral formulation that has been approved by the FDA, and that is tolvaptan, which is a V2 receptor inhibitor. And we have the conivaptan, which is the only IV formulation that is available. And that is V1A 2 receptor inhibitor. So because it acts on the V1A, there is a high risk of hypotension as a side effect in case of conivaptan. So Vaptans should be made sure that it is started in an IP setting. The patient should be admitted because we need to give a liberalization of fluid restriction, because there is a very good chance the patient might lose a lot of fluid. So the fluid restriction can be a little bit liberalized, but because of this, we need to keep the patient under monitoring. Up to 2 liters. We can keep the patient in a dose of more than 2 liters per day. Or else there is going to be a risk of overcorrection. And this can happen in about 10% of cases, even with liberalization of fluid restriction. So once this overcorrection happens, what are we going to do? Again, we are going to treat with desmopressin acetate. I think the dose is 2 micrograms. I'm not sure about this. Please cross-check this. 2 micrograms. Or we can give free water per se. And the preferred is the 5% dextrose water. Nowadays, they say in many of the critical care intensivists apparently have tried treating hyponatremia along with desmopressin and free water treatment also. It is like a balanced way. We are trying it not kind of like a prophylactic thing, wherein we are trying to maintain the bioactivity of arginine vasopressin, and it doesn't go in for hypernatremia. Otherwise, we have to treat this and then go ahead and again treat that. We'll be doing it back and forth. So better to do it even when you're starting it. Once, and it has also been found that when you treat the you use these desmopressin and free water along with hyponatremia correction, the chances of osmotic demyelination syndrome is also less, because definitely you are not going to go beyond 8 millimoles or 10 millimoles if you are going to use it along with desmopressin and free water. So that has proven to be even better. I think have done with hyponatremia, and hyper I'm not discussing today because it's already late. So any questions, I'm ready to take. Any feedback, I'm ready to take.
Sama. Super.
புரிஞ்சிச்சா?
சமயம் புரிஞ்சு. நிறுத்தி நிதானமா
கொஞ்சம் வளர்ன மாதிரி இருந்துச்சு எனக்கு.
இல்ல, we can take notes. Okay. At the same time, we were able to attend nice.
I also have written notes of this, what I have taken. So if anybody want, then you can take it from me. Written notes.